Hi everyone, it's now 5 days until my first Rogue show this year. And yesterday's video, first of all, I tried to set up the lights a little better. This is a teeny tiny room and I've got a lot of stuff in here, so I can't really bring in my nice photography lights, so I kind of just try to make do. At any rate, we've hopefully got that solved. But yesterday I went over the fact that I'm having a problem with my main keyboard here, and it was freezing up. Now, leading up to yesterday's video, in an effort to try and clear up that freezing situation, I went through all of my presets to see if there was any distinction, because it was always freezing up either when I first booted it up or during a performance when I'm going through all my music, specifically on preset number 33. So I went to see if there was anything different about preset 33. And what I noticed was that I had a certain parameter set to off in one of the 4 zones, but to 0 in the other 3. And that parameter was MSB LSB. Now, what does that mean? Okay, well, in MIDI, you have all of these different pieces of information. Obviously, you have note on and off for all the keys. That represents all the keys. If you're going to do a piano sound, it has to be touch sensitive, so you also have to have a velocity parameter set for each of the keys. And then you have other things like program changes, which I use to change the setup on the organ emulator, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But then you also have other things like controllers and controller value changes, which run things like if you have a volume pedal, or like these little sticks over here, which if I was running a synth sound would control the pitch and modulation wheel that are on the side of a hardware synthesizer. So you have all of this stuff that's being sent out by MIDI, and some of it in any given situation is completely irrelevant. And in the case of what I'm doing here, controller changes and MSB LSB codes are completely irrelevant to how the system works. MIDI, of course, was designed back in the early 80s to be a tool for people playing keyboards in like a rock band. But it, of course, found its way into a lot of other uses. But that was the mindset that they were thinking of. So MSB LSB codes were how you would change the sound that you were playing. So say I'm playing along, I'm in a band, and we're doing a song, and I've got a piano going, and then on the next song I need to have a B3 organ sound. Well, I don't have to go over to the sound module that has those sounds on it and fiddle around there. I can tell the keyboard on the next preset change to send the appropriate MSB LSB code for that sound. Now you might be thinking, well, why doesn't that work on a pipe organ emulator? Well, because pipe organs were never about singular sounds. Pipe organs are about combinations of sounds. If you want to, say, play an oboe sound on a pipe organ, you don't just pull the oboe stop. It's almost always you're going to pull the oboe stop and the 4-foot flute stop, because that 4-foot flute is going to make that oboe sound even more like an oboe. You might want to beef up the sound of that oboe, because by itself or with just the 4-foot flute, it's not quite strong enough to be the solo voice you need. Then you might add the 8-foot flute and the 2 2/3. So you're always working in combinations of sounds. So an MSB LSB code is completely useless in that context. Now, the other thing I discovered while I was trying to go through all the presets and see if there was just anything different, why was it always hanging up on number 33? And so what I was looking at is that there were several parameters where I have irrelevant data going out. The MSB LSB code is kind of obvious as being an irrelevant piece of data, but what wasn't obvious and I didn't think about when I was first setting this all up is that when I went through all the presets, I found that the MSB LSB codes were either set to off or 0. And instinctively, one might think, well, 0 would be the same thing as off, wouldn't it? Not really. And this has to do, I understand, I've been told anyway, with kind of computer nomenclature. So in MIDI, for example, there are 128 note possibilities. Piano keyboard has 88, so you're not using them all, but they're there if you should need to use them for some reason. 128 increments apparently is a convenient thing to do in computer data transfers, and that's how MIDI works. Everything is in increments of 128. There's 128 notes. There's 128 velocity increments. There's 128 increments of volume. There's 128 increments of a controller change. But those 128 increments are represented as 0 through 127. So 0 in MIDI language is still an increment. So that means I still have irrelevant data being sent. Is that possibly tripping things up? I don't know. What I do know is that when I made preset 33 look like the presets on either side of it in terms of MSB, LSB data, it stopped hanging up on 33. But then it started hanging up on 38, and always 38, every time. So looking at that preset, I couldn't see anything that was really possibly an issue. But in looking at how I have set things up, I do have a lot of irrelevant MIDI data being sent out. The things that I have to control in addition to the notes I'm playing is I have to control the voice settings on the organ emulator, and that's done with what are called pistons. On an organ you would have little thumb pistons, and each of those would be programmed to bring up a combination of stops. You can probably kind of see it here. On this we have these pistons here, and you can see different combinations of the stops on the C200 come up with one of those piston changes. Same thing over here. And the way it works in MIDI terms is that each of the 100 pistons available is assigned a program change value. The other thing that responds to program change values are my effects processors. So when I need to change the setting on the effects processor, one of the 4 layers on the keyboard sends out a program change to one or both of those, or all 3 of the effects processors. Well, I only need to send that data when there's actually a change called for. It doesn't make any sense to send that program change, the same program, every time. And in the case of the effects processors, every time they receive a program change, they cut out the sound for about a second. So, but again, in this case, I still have something going out. It just isn't sending a program change. So the long of the short of all of that confusing gobbledygook I just said is that the next thing I'm going to do is go through all the presets, and I'm just going to flat out shut down anything that is irrelevant. The fact that it's not sending a value doesn't mean it isn't sending something. So I need to shut that down. I also took out the MIDI connection that goes from this keyboard to this keyboard because I'm not actually playing any of the built-in sounds on this keyboard on this keyboard. I'm also found that there is a volume off position, and I'm engaging that in any parameter where it's sending something, because again, the organ emulator on the computer does not respond to that. But again, we don't need, that's irrelevant data. I don't need to send that. This keyboard does respond to that. And one of the things that happens when this thing freezes up is that when I reboot, this is now on 127. So I have to reboot it as well to get it back to 70. If I'm simply not sending anything to this keyboard, that shouldn't happen. The bottom line on that freezing problem is that there's really nothing I can do about that except the obvious things that aren't going to make any difference anyway. I don't think that eliminating irrelevant data sends from the main keyboard is actually going to make a difference, because I think the freezing problem is within the keyboard itself. I do not have time to reload the firmware in hopes that that clears it up, or as another nice person suggested, just revert back to the original firmware. I can't even see how you would do that, and again, that in and of itself could cause issues. The freezing problem seems to happen only after this keyboard has been on and in use for more than 2 hours. My show is less than an hour, so when it does freeze, if I shut it down, reset it, it comes back and it works fine. So I'm just going to have to, at this point, take the chance that maybe it's going to freeze during a show. It's always program 38, which now is where it's freezing, is right at the end of the last song. So I'll, just fake my way through the ending of that, I guess, if it happens. We'll see. But there just isn't anything I can do about it at this point. We're too close to the show. I need to rehearse. And what I'm going to do from now on, after I eliminate all irrelevant data sends, I'm just going to run through my show repeatedly. Each time I'm going to shut everything down and reboot everything. Maybe that'll keep the little electronic brains inside all this gear cleared up. I know sometimes I need to flush my mind out once in a while, so maybe my virtual intelligence here needs to do that too. Any rate, so that's what's going on today in prep for the Rogue Festival. Tomorrow you're probably going to see me in a slightly different location. I'm going to move all of this out into actually my kitchen, and probably going to do that tonight. And then I'm going to set up the main PA speakers that are going to project the sound for the audience. And then you can actually hear some of what I'm doing on these videos. We'll see you next time.